You're not going to be that lucky, Rick.
Rick, you can't let the commoners think.
Oh, no.
At any moment, Donald and I might run for office.
The horror, the horror.
All right.
Well, then let's load up our chat here. Millennial Microcosm. Week, is it 76?
I think so.
Yeah. Let's see. Yep, 76, week 76. And we're in chapter 4, Ancient Civ. Okay. So we're now working on bringing section F to a close. And as part of that, we have a couple of paragraphs to go, but now we're moving at a different pace than we were before. So let's do a quick. Let's just get these.
We stabbed it with our steely knives, but we just could not kill the beast.
Yes, yes.
Oh.
We sort of opened up, I think, some of the astonishing scope that's implied by section F. It's a massive shift of worldviews, and it took longer to get through section F. I mean, we're still not through it, but it took longer to get through the core part of section F than the previous 5 sections put together. Each one of these previous sections was giving us some critical insight into the ancients to pave the way for section F. But even with all that ramp up, I still don't think it's, no writer's perfect. I don't think we had all of the tools we needed when we entered section F. And it might be that there wasn't any other intro that could have been done. We just had to dig in and grapple with it. But this general idea of completely inverting the concept of a myth from being a falsehood to being a truth, and that part of making that work is that myth has to be redefined so that almost everything we call a myth in the modern world is not a myth from the ancient perspective. That our use of the truth, they would say we're using the word wrong, and they'd be astonished by the things that we call myths and say, my God, how can you function in the world? And of course, then they'd look around and see world wars and global warming, all the other things and go, oh, I see. you don't, basically, from an ancient perspective, we aren't functioning. And, they would say that the critical part is that we lack the mythic mind. We don't have any adults. Nobody takes the level of responsibility in the modern world that people used to take in the ancient world. Now, these kind of interpretations of the ancient perspective, I'm glad you brought up, we owe an enormous amount to Nietzsche for helping to go back to the original definitions of the words and idioms and sort of peel away 1,000 years of medieval interpretation, if you will. And also, he's having to peel away several centuries of modernist interpretation that followed. And that like Stephen was saying, the modernist interpretation of the Greeks was based on starting with the medieval interpretation, chucking out God, whether they're admitting it or not, but from a medieval perspective, chucking out God, and then saying, and that's all that the medievals did in 1,000 years to our understanding of the Greeks. All we have to do is remove the Christian God, and surely we will see with clear, unalloyed eyes what it is that the Greeks meant, which couldn't be further from the truth, right? Because each of these worldviews for these epochs redefines all of the critical terms, all of the critical concepts to make an organic whole. And if you take a medieval worldview and you say, goodbye, God, what you have left is a medieval worldview. I mean, it's like hardly anything has changed. You just removed one element, and the element plays a critical role in the medieval worldview. So, it's like an arch where you pull out the keystone. It's a lot worse than that, but it's like an arch where you pull out the keystone and what's left is still almost all of the arch, but now it doesn't function correctly. The result is a liberated worldview.
Well, Rick, you know, I when I was in high school, we had a high school English teacher who gave A, B, C, D, and no Fs. What she replaced F with was NT. Nice try. Is that what you're trying to say? We should replace F with nice try. We'll never understand it.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of what makes this of the sections we've gone through so far. Some of the earlier ones were easier. I mean, they were bold and they were interesting, but they were easier. Nature as becoming. You know, we aren't in peak modernity. We're in late stage modernity, and so there has already been work pulling apart. Modernity is already pulling apart its own mechanistic, static worldview because of its inadequacies. And it hasn't got very far yet, but it's got far enough that everybody's heard of chaos theory. Everybody's heard of the idea that maybe evolution doesn't work like a machine, that history doesn't work like a. We're starting to get this idea that the pure classic ideology of modernity, which we don't admit we have, right? We think we see with pure eyes, but that pure formulation, strictly Newtonian, right, Cartesian worldview, doesn't actually explain everything. We had to have quantum physics, we had to have relativity, everything's getting stretchy and and not dividing up into as many pieces as we want. Things are starting to come unravel. So we're sort of prepared a bit for nature as becoming, right? The concept that things flow and change, we're having to, you know, with modern systems theory, we're having to start to take baby steps in that direction. So the idea that there could be an alternative worldview in which that's the starting place, it's bold and radical, but we can start to wrap our heads around it in a way that Newton couldn't have, or, you know, a 19th century or 20th century physicist could not have. Nature as intrinsic truth, here too, we're semi-prepared because science has been in a wrestling match with modernist ideology, you know, in which it's partially digested into modernity and becomes an organ of it, but also is partially at odds with it because science keeps telling us, okay, your theories and systems are all well and good, but have you tested them? You know, it's you can talk to a modern about the idea that we don't really have political science because we don't really put our political theories to the test, which means they're not actually valid scientific theories, right? You can start to get somebody to understand this idea because science is already a poor fit for modernity. It doesn't entirely want to be digested into the noetic processes of the mind. It keeps tugging us back to gnosis and saying, you have to test your stuff. You have to put it back out into reality. You can't just reason your way to the end. You sort of see this in the tension between the science that wants to present itself as an established body of natural laws, i.e. absolute truths that you must accept, versus the science that wants to test things and find out what's true and what's not true. There's this tug of war for the soul of science. So that makes it possible for us, you know, to sort of grapple with the concept that nature might be a source of intrinsic truth. And when we think in terms of what Carl Sagan called Science One, which is the philosophy of putting our ideas to the test, we can start to buy the idea that, yeah, we have to go back to nature to find out what's real. Our theory has to be tested against that. And it doesn't matter how good or pretty or beautiful or socially acceptable or wealth generating a theory it is, if it doesn't pass nature's test, it's not intrinsically true. We can sort of get that. So this is what I mean when I say, for example, A, it's interesting to grapple with A. There's challenges for us. It's kind of a warm-up, but it doesn't come close to the level of difficulty of the flip in values associated with seeing mythos culture and the mythic mind as the highest, most mature form of the human mind that we're supposed to grow into. The idea that moderns aren't the best. We're not the most grown up. We don't see things the clearest. You know, it's one thing to sort of accept that abstractly. It's something else to be presented with the alien thing, the mythic mind, and go, well, that can't be. Okay, I could buy that something's better, but God, it can't be that. That seems to judge us all. You know, the more you wrestle with this concept of mythos and the mythic mind, the more value laden it is, and the more uncomfortable it is to be in its presence. Phil, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I have a question in my mind that you might be able to answer because you're sort of deep into computer science. From what little I understand about quantum computing, it's about, I think, qubits, like little segments. So how they deal with probability theory in a way is to create a lot of these, and so that there was a kind of a how should I say, anticipatory probability that should somehow come close to matching the quantum wave theory. So that is a kind of a chopping up a reality, a continuous reality into little qubits that, in a sense, could add up to a probability that, in a sense, relatively speaking, could predict the quantum wave. I mean, is that true? Because if that's true, that seems like it's still kind of like, how should I say, dividing a mechanical theory into little bits that could kind of imitate, still represent the reality of the quantum wave. Is that true? From what I'm hearing, because I don't understand it well enough to make a decision, judgment on that.
I'm going to check in with Donald and see if he's done anything with quantum computing, because I haven't. I'm a specialist.
Okay.
That's not my area. I mean, I'm aware that it exists and is in some fashion inspired by quantum physics, but exactly what the connection is, I don't know.
Neither me, Sha, as they say in Louisiana. But no, I don't know.
Yeah, I know a lot more about quantum physics than I do about quantum computing. So at some point I should get off my butt and go read up on it.
Okay. I hate to think that I'm the expert, but
might be.
At least I heard about it.
Right. It's a good question.
But the question is still nice that if I'm at all close to the thing, it is not the, how should I say, a true representation of things as they are, but a kind of like mathematical projection, that captures to a high probability, let's put it that way, how things might be. So there you go. There's never going to be enough quantum computing to actually smooth out the wave, in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll I'll do some remedial reading, see if I can be more useful on this question in future classes. Stephen, what's on your mind?
Yeah, so actually I was looking at section G, and we come up with the second paragraph. At the core of every individual self is a heterogeneous character, the logic of its own potential energies. Now, I might bring that line up again later, but we use the word logic quite often. In this particular section, it's mythos versus logos. And I mean, I had that problem with Mr. Spock, actually. He never shut up about logic. And I always felt that rational, that's an easy word to understand, because you can have a rational world conception. You believe the universe operates to a series of rules or laws. That is a world conception, as Goethe would put it. That's your outlook on the world. But how does the word logic operate? We do have formal logic. And yeah, that sort of makes sense most of the time. But what are the broader implications of the word logic? I was looking up the Sanskrit origins of the words, and like the word rational means to measure, ratio, measurement. But logic means to gather together, unless you're gathering together sticks, which are actually involved in a measurement process, like ice cream sticks. I can gather my ice cream sticks together and say, yeah, that's it, man.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. So let's talk about both of those, logical and rational. We'll start with logical. You know, having said what he said in section F, mythos and logos, once you get used to Kenneth Smith's sense of humor and style of writing, you can tell that he's putting the word logic here on purpose in order to needle us. It's deliberately here in order to bug us. And he's putting it, this is a reference back to when he said that, you know, mythos is the way of explaining the logos of the suke. What is the logic of the psyche? And then he parenthetically adds the psychological, right? And in that he's dancing, he's really playing around with the absolute incompatibility of Heraclitus's concept of the logos and the modern concept of logic, right? He's basically saying, you know, because Heraclitus spends a fair number of fragments saying as baldly as he can that we think we're intelligent, but we're not. What encompasses us, nature, is intelligent. That has real understanding, but we don't have real understanding. And so there are two logics. There is the logic that's the capital L logos of nature, and that's a perfect logic. And from our perspective, you know, the reason we call it perfect is because that logos has, you know, that's an expression of the character of nature, its underlying principles that has allowed nature to generate everything, including us. We couldn't even be here to ask these questions if the logos of nature weren't adequate to the task. By contrast, he says, you know, and that's what he refers to when he says, you know, the shared intelligence that we all ought to cling to. We ought to be focusing on what we have in common, what's shared, which is this deeper logos of nature. He says, but instead people are idiots and they turn away to their own private intelligence as though that were even remotely up to the task of understanding nature, ourselves, what we ought to do, or really anything else. So he sets up this tension between the little L logic and the great big L logos, and says, you know, from a human perspective, anytime we're in a conversation with other people, even if we're in a conversation with ourselves and these words come up, it's not safe for us to take it as having a single definition. We have to be asking ourselves, where does the speaker come down on this question of big L logos versus lower L logic? You know, are they attributing virtues to lower L logic that actually only apply to upper L logos, right? Which is what moderns do relentlessly. We believe that our systems are beautiful and wonderful, and that's how we're going to make a better world, is by scripting everything with a perfect legal system that tells you exactly what to do at all times, so that there's no messy, ugly, subjective free will gets in the way of it. We don't think that's what we're doing, but if you look at the proliferation of systems of laws, of systems of mathematics and logic and so forth, it's obvious that's what we're doing. You know, almost every critic comes to the same conclusion. We're attempting to mechanize everything about ourselves and our world. And that's lowercase logic, which is the idiotism, the noesis gone mad, you know, the banal sea, the excessive use of Verstand, you know, that symptomatizes logos culture in general. So when he's saying at the core of every individual self is a heterogeneous character, the logic of its own potential energies. When he's talking about potential energies, he's going past the surface noesis and getting down to questions of character. Because Heraclitus always describes the archai, the principles that make up the character of nature, as being powers or energies. He describes an energetic cosmos. He uses fire as his metaphor and transformation. He talks about the way that they collide with each other and conflict with each other in order to create dynamic systems that generate the order that we see. So clearly, the logic of its own potential energies in this sentence, given what a Heraclitean Kenneth Smith is, this is going right back to this Heraclitean concept of the nature of human character. So he's not talking about, he says logic with a lowercase l, but he means the logos, the capital L logos that is underlying the nature within us. Like where Heraclitus says the nature around us and the nature within us, the two natures that we stand between. Here he's describing, you know, basically the kind of thing that we can only apprehend through gnosis and not really through noesis. Noesis will tend to misunderstand and over systematize its understanding of our own self. In the same way that people have this false model of who they are, which leads them into endless trouble, which is why the Oracle at Delphi says Gnothi Seauton. Gnothi, gnosis, not the noesis version of Gnothi. So this is what he's
there's a problem there. The modern view, the mechanistic view, is to regard objective reality as being the measure of all things. The amazing thing is people keep on forgetting that the subjective, the instrument you're actually doing the observing with, the human, is not objective.
Yes. Yeah.
That you're subject to the limitations of your instrument.
That's right.
In viewing the cosmos.
That's
but
right.
That just doesn't enter into it. I use the example of saying, well, dog's a pretty clever animal, but you won't see many dogs, dealing in stocks and bonds or something like that, will you? No.
Right.
Nevertheless, dog's very clever. It's got a consciousness. It's got some sort of level of awareness, but it's just not going to understand what a stock exchange is.
It's just not interested in that sort of thing. It can't bring itself to care.
Well, it does help if you're interested.
They always gnosis, say. Right? It's gnosis and its instincts draw it into a gnosic appreciation of reality in which there's almost no place for a spreadsheet, right?
But modern thought has concluded it has an objective view of the universe.
Yes.
Pure objectivity.
Pure objectivity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's what's brilliant.
The word logos reminds me of the scientific process. So I have delineated the word as a method. And that is, in the scientific process, we pull things apart and then we reassemble them. And maybe somehow logic is connected with this. Like mythos is the opposite. Mythos is letting things sink into you without tearing it apart.
Forming a whole. A larger whole.
When we analyse things, we're pulling things apart.
Yes.
Now, we have both faculties, which are opposites. Both perform a function, both are necessary, and neither is to be ignored.
Right.
Mythos is not to be ignored. Right. That ability to soak in understanding without tearing things apart is a vital part of what we are, of how we navigate the world. For starters, that tendency to instantly know things is necessary if there's a tree and a lion behind you.
Yes.
You're going to get up that tree. You're not going to speculate whether I can climb that tree or not. You'll be up that tree before you've speculated.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, part of our challenge here is that this definition of mythos that he's laying out in section F is focusing on the idea that although logos corresponds to noesis, mythos does not correspond to gnosis. This is not just something that's hard to keep track of on our own. It's hard to keep track of because Kenneth slips in his writing sometimes. He slips in his writing because he's speaking to a hypernoetic audience. And so he has to keep reminding them of the importance of gnosis. He has to keep re-emphasizing gnosis over and over and over in order to try to get us to rebalance our understanding and give gnosis the credit that it's due. But of course, he's not actually saying that the wisdom can be found in pure gnosis, although you may actually find a sentence like that here or there in Kenneth Smith, but it's not really what he means. He means gnosis and noesis harnessed together into a dynamic system is what we need. We need to be using both our faculties, effectively, and that's what creates the mythic mind, or rather, the mythic mind creates that, right? When we adopt the mythic perspective, we start to understand the intrinsic potential for tragedy in everything that we do because of the structure of our mind. That gives us the warning and the motivation to always be looking to string these two faculties together into a dynamic system and to resist the temptation, the siren song, to slip into one or the other, which they're always singing to us. Always. We are just like a drug addict sitting in the room with the drug right next to him. We're constantly being called to give up any kind of dynamic, palintropy that we might have created out of these two faculties of our mind. It's like, that's too hard. See how good it feels to just do noesis, or see how good it feels to just do gnosis. We're constantly being, drawn. Before I call on the people with their hands up, which I'm really looking forward to, I want to touch on rationality, because I think rationality, laughter, Nietzsche's dancing, laughing philosopher, the vitalist, right, is this powerful metaphor for what happens. What might an Aristos be like? Well, an Aristos loves life, says Nietzsche, without using those words. He says he's in touch because he's refused the dry, sear, juiceless life of a hypernoetic person, because he resists that life and reconnects to the live wire experience of the infant. He's full of passions and feelings and subjectivities, and that includes laughter and irony and all kinds of other modes that Nietzsche demonstrates, much to the befuddlement of modern academics reading him. So the mythic mind is just full of these emotions. It's a powerfully emotional state. It's just that it's also armed with noesis at the same time, right? It's not single-minded in that way. So the joke here is the origins of the word rationality, which to a modern, rationality means everything good about the life of the mind, all of the good parts. And irrationality means everything bad about the life of the mind, all of the bad parts. And of course, in modernity, you split that by saying, well, noesis is objectivity, right? So because noesis convinces itself that it sees the world the way it actually is, it makes that subjective claim that it's objective. And by doing so, it therefore identifies noesis with objectivity and therefore with virtue. And then it identifies gnosis with subjectivity. That's where all the ugly feelings are, which are the cause of all evil things. Every bad thing we ever do that we think up to do, that must be the subjective part of our mind. And so we're going to scapegoat that and say, that's why we call it irrationality. There's nothing good there. It's only an absence, an abyss that's missing, all the good stuff. But what's hilarious about this is that rationality actually begins in ratios, which begins with Pythagoras and the concept that the discovery of rational numbers, which are numbers that can be expressed as a ratio of two other numbers, right? 1/2, 3/4, 4/5, 4/2. All of these ratios fascinated the Pythagorean movements, and they formed a cult around this movement. It goes well beyond philosophy. I mean, this is way back, right? Pythagoras is early. They formed a cult, and their cult was that the entire universe could be understood through ratios. That's why they enforced the teaching of music. They recognized the ratios that are involved, in the different notes on the harmonic scale. They also expressed the music of the spheres comes out of that movement. The idea that the planets are all at some kind of a perfect distance. There must be a harmonic scale of ratios of the distances of the planets, and as they swing in their arcs through the sky, they're making some kind of celestial music that can only be heard and appreciated by the gods. Everything's ratios. So this idea that everything in the universe can be explained with a single metaphor is a hypernoetic oversimplification of everything, right? It is definitely of the school of reductionism that says you don't need 1,000 theories, you only need one. Our one theory is going to explain every last thing, which is absolutely not true, and which they themselves discovered when they discovered the square root of 2. It was the Pythagoreans who discovered the square root of 2, which cannot be expressed as a ratio of any two numbers. They discovered the irrational numbers and they hated them. There's a apocryphal story that it was Pythagoras himself who discovered the square root of 2, and he was nervous about telling his followers because they were so attached to the idea of ratios explaining everything and every number being a ratio, and they're on a ship voyage somewhere, and he finally, opens up and says, "Hey, I found this number that actually can't be expressed as two ratios. What do you think?" And they all look at each other and they look at him and they throw him overboard, and that's how Pythagoras died. They're like, "Absolutely not. We're having absolutely none of this. This is not allowed in our worldview." Now, as far as we know, that's absolutely false. This is one of those kinds of stories that resenters like Diogenes Laertius used to pass around. Look, this guy died hoist on his own petard as a result of his own theory. But the general idea that rationality, although defined by moderns to mean all good things, objective things of the mind, is not actually that, but is actually a cult, hyper-subjective cult that is attempting to reduce reality to something that can't actually explain reality. That it is the height of irrationality to believe that rationality explains all things. This is an unthinkable thought to a modern, because the word rationality, we don't want it. We don't want that to be its origins. We don't want that to be where it came from.
Well, the word rationality means to measure. And you've adopted something as a standard measure. The rule is foot. You have a foot and you measure all things by a foot, and you say, that's big and that's small, based on the rationale of your original measure. I think, since you like Star Trek, the example where there was that planet of the androids.
Yes.
And Harry Fenton Mudd lands on the planet. And they take him as the standard measure of all other humans, although they woke up after a while, he was so corrupt. No. So first, empirically, they took him as a standard measure, and then they're proclaiming their intrinsic rationale is, no, this couldn't be even human beings couldn't be as bad as this. Of course, the thing with Harry Fenton Mudd is he could do good things as long as you kept him on a leash and not let him go too far. Yeah. So the rationales conceived of the fate for man is that humanity had to be kept on a leash.
Yes, which is what Diogenes says, right?
Oh, I didn't realize that. Diogenes.
A proper conduct of life requires either right reason or a leash, says Diogenes.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Phil, then Donald, then James. Go ahead, Phil. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking about this, I was thinking about Arche and now your logos. Like one of the things about human beings is that we are so attached to language, and language is instantiated with words, I suppose. It seems to me that there's a couple views of language. I mean, like one of the things about like a Greek word or a German word I've learned so far, in a sense, is much more complex than, let's say, English, which seems to be an attempt to really be precise at what it's saying. And the question becomes, should a word or language be striving to be really precise in its measured way, or would that really do violence to the fact that words should reflect the way the world is or nature is, that it's irreducible, that it is multidimensional at the ground level? Because what happened when it's multidimensional, what the poets like, but in actually everyday life, we know that too, that when you use a word, it depends on the context. And the context then is, oh, that's what it means. So that you could get precision in relationship to the multidimensional nature of a word by the fact that the context will fulfill the meaning of how it's applied. But unfortunately, if you have words that only have a specific meaning, it's useless in a particular context that is not appropriate for. So you would have to have a head that's the size of a building to have all those words, and you have to learn all those words by rote. Oh, yeah, this is the word I need, and the particular operation that I need to do. Whereas that when you have fewer words, then you're burdened with the fact that you have to have ability to make a judgment. Does it really fit in this context? Because, if it doesn't, then you said, no, we have to think of something else, or we have to think of another way of thinking. So that context adds a dimensionality to it. And we're smart enough. Now, of course, if you're a person that is incapable of making judgments and interpretations, then you're in a lot of trouble, because you're going to have an originalist interpretation that the earth is indeed only 7,000 years old. We know this is to be true because the Bible says so. And so in this sense, I think it really comes down to the fact that, if you want, say, mythos embody this, and poetry, in a sense, embodies, it's surplus in a way. Not that you should, take poetry like, oh, the poet used this word. Now I'm doing an open heart surgery. I'm gonna start reciting Homer's poem, whatever. That's not gonna work in that context. And you have to be smart enough that, it's time not to recite Homer. Let's do something else with those words. So I think this is one of the things that we have lost by trying to be more precise, when precision in certain contexts does not work, because you have to know that, for instance, even if you take a regular thing like like a hammer, if I had a hammer, I could do this and that and that. Yes, you could use a hammer in all sorts of ways. As one guy said, you could use it as a paperweight. Like, got nothing else, you put a hammer there that'll use as a paperweight. But that's not really the appropriate use, but you could use it, So in a certain situation, a word could be used and misused somewhat to a certain degree, and you understand the context will acknowledge that. But on the other hand, it has an appropriate use, which is to hammer a nail. So I think we've lost the fact that we do not like this multiplicity. And I think that's the way things are, which means that you always have to make judgments. You always have to be thinking like, well, should I be doing this or that, So that's what I got to say. It comes down to the fact of letting words have some breathing room for us to interpret. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, first thing, Bible doesn't say anything about how old the earth is. Some interpretations of it add up all those begots or begats or whatever they were and said that. I've had this argument with my relatives. They're not convinced, but I was. That there's no sentence in there that says how old it is. And that they're the ones that are the biblical revisionist.
I bet they love that.
No, they don't. But if you're pursuing a philosophical life and you come to understand the importance of genothes theauton, then mythos is your tool. Mythos is what you want to understand yourself. That's the kind of, not exclusively, but like the kind of truths that myths have. They're truths about the nature of people. And for a third observation is that philosophy is what psychology would be if it knew what studying the soul was all about. But I don't know if Kenneth would say that or not, but modern, I don't know. His use in the previous paragraph of the psychological in such a bizarre way is he's poking fun at somebody. But it makes me, because modern psychology isn't the study of the soul, not in any way. It's I don't know what it is, but the other thing that the Greeks had in these matters was a strong sense of what's healthy or what's normal or what, not just there's this distribution and they're all this types and it's just frequency of occurrence and stuff like that. There was an implied judgment that it's better to be one way than the other, and almost all of our sciences directed towards people have taken that element out, starting certainly in the 20th, and now it's almost, there's no, what's a normal person? Well, there's no concept of normal, there's just lots of different kinds, and we should be accepting.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
And I'm not going to comment on whether that's preferable or not, but it's certainly a big change between antiquity and now, is the ability to say, well, except for Texas, where no, the guy, there's a dead man lying on the floor and a Texan standing over him with a gun, and the sheriff says, "What happened here?" And the Texan says, "Well, some men just need to be killed." We have no concept like that generally about modernity, that, well, the way you solve this problem or something is they have to be killed. Well, enough.
Well, and the great problem, of course, for human beings and making that judgment is we're so bad at it. We kill people who didn't need to be killed, and then we blindly follow people who maybe did need to be killed. It's like our judgment of how to apply these things is so rotten. It's like a kid thinking that they should shoot their BB gun inside the house, and it's a complete surprise every time a vase breaks. The glass on the window on the picture frame breaks, the window glass breaks, and they can't figure out why it's going wrong. It's like, I think the solution here for the moment is that you should not have this in your possession because you don't know what the hell you're doing. Right. Somebody who knows when and where you should shoot a BB gun can have a BB gun. You are not that person yet. And I think that's how it applies to us when it comes to judgment about the value of things. As moderns, our judgment is so deeply flawed. You kind of just want to tell moderns, just settle down and cool off for a while, take a nap. We'll start over with kindergarten lessons tomorrow.
Rick, you have to be careful. Remember, Donald that lives in Texas, so be careful.
He's got a sense of humor.
I'm not applying to you, Donald, but I am.
No, I actually live I'm in Arizona. We're
is that right?
Slightly different.
Okay.
I mean, probably as well armed, but
yeah. So, yeah. this whole area of objective and subjective and judging and non-judging, and I mean, this is rich material, and I guess, it's part of the, I think it's one thing to say there are no Aristoi in modernity, that the systems of modernity are very designed isn't the right word, but have converged upon being very effective at suppressing the development of Aristoi. But I think that's what I haven't emphasized in the past, is that's a far cry from saying that nobody ever gets even the slightest taste of heuristic behavior or impulses. Because people who spend a long time in a profession wrestling with it and with themselves and their limitations, who don't buy entirely into any schema, but are trying to humanize it and figure out how to be good at it, but also how to transcend its limitations. People like that will get little tastes of they'll have heuristic moments that give them a taste of what it would be like. And, for example, Sharon, as her career, in anesthesiology and running anesthesia teams, she's been at it long enough that she's gone well past the book learning stage, of a medical student, to where she has so much experience that she can self-critique while she goes. That is to say, her approach to objectivity is better than it was when she was a med student, because her experience and her appetite for self-understanding and self-criticism has brought her to a stage where she can be more objective now, because she's got the taste of her own subjectivity enough that she can start to figure out when her subjectivity is going to contaminate her objectivity, so that she can start to take into account her patterns of errors. I imagine Donald is like that as a programmer. I am like that as a programmer in the areas I work in, where I make certain habitual kinds of mistakes because of the way I type and the way I think, especially the way I'm currently trying to write a simple subroutine, but the next problem is going to be harder. And so while I'm typing what should be an easy subroutine to write, my brain starts trying to jump ahead and solve the problem I'm not actually working on yet. And next thing I know, I've accidentally typed one of the words from the next problem in the middle of the current problem. This is a typical Rick typo, right? In which this word doesn't belong here. This afternoon I'll be writing that subroutine, but this is boring. It's so easy that it's boring, and my brain wandered and began inserting things that don't belong there. This is a habitual mistake, right? And so I've got to the point where I know my pattern of errors well enough, I can take my subjectivity into account, and it can improve my objectivity, because I'm more likely to catch the mistakes that I would otherwise make. And also, and I don't know if Donald has this experience too, the other thing that comes with it is you get to where, when you're an effective programmer and have been for a long time, you have learned to pay attention to the kinds of errors that result in horrible, hard to debug problems. You try to head those off at the pass, because you don't ever want to, once again, create that kind of problem that takes you a week or 3 weeks to debug. And so while you're watching for those, you make simple typos. And so the result is the quality of errors you make shifts from the hard to debug errors to the simple to debug errors that just sort of jump out. It's like, well, that obviously won't work, and I can see the problem and I fix it and I'm done. I make a lot fewer database corruptions, which are hard to debug, than I did early in my career. But the result of that is, because my brain is watching out for those really bad problems, that means it's those 7 plus or minus 2 points of consciousness are no longer available to focus on. Oops, I typed an F when I should have typed a D. I make simple errors that in the past would have embarrassed me. I mean, Donald, is that your experience too? That kind of.
I often get caught up when I was coding in aesthetics, that the code had to look a certain way.
Yes.
And that would lead me off of the simplest thing that always works,
right,
or the clearest thing that always works. I would find myself trying to solve a specific problem in a very generic way for no reason. Just solve it. And since I did a lot of semi-real-time stuff, I race conditions and thread coordination, synchronization was always a problem. And I became the person that when a multi-threaded program was failing, it was always, I'm the one that got to look at that, because there were so many people that, well, you know, semaphores are in Java, the auto synchronization and stuff, multi-threading, it'll just work. Well, no, it won't just work.
Right.
It will just get into a race condition. Something very bad will happen, and you won't be able to figure it out because I don't know. Since I started very low down at machine language stuff for a long time, for about a decade before I got to higher languages, I'm very sensitive to how the processor, what is the processor actually going to do? And I worked with a lot of people that all they had was the language model. And as the languages became more abstract over my career, the problems of other programmers having a good knowledge of what they had coded would actually do became less and less. I'm afraid it won't be long before there won't be any programmers. I mean, in the sense of, you know, they're all coding to some high level abstraction, some API that's so far from what computers are doing that if it doesn't work, I don't know what they'll do. They just give up. Enough. Let's go back to
Yeah, yeah. So these are just metaphors to try to explain the idea of there is, if we directly pursue objectivity, there are limits to how accurately we can describe reality, because our over focus on the problem and under focus on our own subjectivity leaves us liable to making characteristic mistakes because of our subjectivity. But with experience, as we become less overwhelmed by the objective side of the problem, because we've done it a lot, we start to free up resources that can go back and look at the subjective side of the problem, which is, what are the kinds of mistakes I typically make? And how can I watch out for those? So for every science or discipline or engineering, there develops a meta science or meta discipline or meta engineering that can create more realistic results because it's factoring in the subjectivity in a way that simple-minded objectivity couldn't, if this makes sense. It's like this is another way of saying the limits of our objectivity are the defects in the lens with which we're looking. And if we want to do better than that, we better start to understand the lens so that we can correct for it. Hegel talks about this in, I think it's in the Phenomenology of Geist. I don't think it's in the Philosophy of Geist. I think it's in the Phenomenology, where he talks about this is what has to be done to try to compensate for human weaknesses and understanding, but it's important for us to understand that this process can never lead to genuine objectivity because you're burning extra cycles having to correct for mistakes, and that reduces your fluency, your ability to respond. He says this is part of the human condition. We're just never going to see things exactly the way they are, the way something divine could. We can imagine a divinity that's capable of seeing reality as it is in all of its infinite complexity without having to constantly compensate for defects in its understanding the way a human being would have to. But for us, the closest we can approximate to that is with the dynamic system in which our subjectivity and objectivity correct each other. James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Yeah, this is a very interesting discussion about subjectivity and objectivity. So this you have this list in the chat from A to F. Are these like representations of that kind of dichotomy between subjectivity and objectivity?
These are the major sections that we've gone through in chapter 4 so far. So this is kind of looking back and saying, where we began before you joined was kind of wrestling with this problem. Why was Section F so hard for us? Why did it take so many months just to do this one? We looked at the quality of the challenges that the earlier sections faced. So far, we've only really talked about A, but what were the big ideas that were hard for us to wrap our heads around in understanding the ancient worldview, and seeing how, although they were challenges, they weren't challenges on the scale of Section F, because Section F is trying to get us to completely invert our concept of what a mature human mind could be. So that's what those are doing there.
Well, for A, it would be this subjectivity would be more like in line with acknowledging the nature of becoming in reality, right? As opposed to an intrinsic truth that you can objectify. Would that be something like that? And then the mythos would be acknowledging the idea that mythos includes this notion of subjectivity as well as objectivity. Whereas if you only take the logos perspective, you're thinking more in terms of objectivity. Like mathematics, it would be something like an objective view of things where you measure by way of mathematics and you turn aspects of reality into an objective truth that is static, right? As opposed to acknowledging that it is in the process of part of the process of becoming, which has to be understood by way of a subjective kind of mythos point of view, right?
Yeah.
And yeah. So like the idea of measurement is really brings to mind Zeno's paradox, where the idea is that you measure things and therefore not you measure it because you can think of it in terms of a static object in space. You just freeze things in space and then you can measure it, and because it's static. But by doing that, you have to deny that there's motion.
Yeah,
it's a way of denying. It's a way of denying movement and motion and becoming.
Right, right, and the great danger of logos culture, which, and again, here we're dealing with we're using capital letters because it's a section name, but the logos we're talking about here is the lowercase logos. When we're talking about culture, logos culture doesn't refer to nature's actual logos. It refers to the nomos, our attempts to simulate the logos through our own systems of thinking. And our simulation, of course, falls short of reality. Now that's where the intrinsic truth part of nature as intrinsic truth in Section 8 comes in, is that the ancients understood that nature was the ultimate authority on what's true and what's not true. And that to say something is true according to nature, katafuse, which is a phrase that Aristotle uses over and over and over in his essays, that's to say it doesn't need to be proven, because if it's actually happening that way in nature, then it's real. Unlike anything that we claim, anything that could come out of my mouth, we have to look at with skepticism, because things aren't automatically intrinsically true just because we accept them, but they are automatically intrinsically true if nature manifests them. Then we know that it's a real thing. So this concept that the ultimate source of truth is not the law, it's not math, it's not logic, it's not the economy, it's not any human creation or system, but rather the natural systems of nature, which have an authority that goes far beyond the human. Now, this is another way of sort of expressing the way that the ancients conceived of nature as the highest priority, as a source of meaning.
Right. So the idea of mythos is that acknowledging that we are creatures with this mythos, this mythos creating function, mythos inventing function or faculty, and that we are constantly, inventing myths, about reality. more than the fact that we acknowledge that there's only one myth or two myths that tell us what reality is. But the idea that myth implies that we're constantly in the process of inventing new myths, new stories about what reality is, right? So that would be the kind of the subjective way of understanding reality.
Well, the mythos in this case is not merely in opposition to logos, or rather, to put it another way, we're not equating mythos with gnosis and logos with noesis. We're saying logos equates lowercase l logos, the human tendency towards logic and systemization. That does equate with noesis, but mythos, the mythic mind, Vernunft, is the heuristic approach. This is the result of making both gnosis and noesis work together, to harness them to each other, to correct each other. So mythos is the synthesis of noesis and gnosis in this context, rather than being one or the other.
Okay, yeah. So mythos is does mythos imply this kind of inventive faculty?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's not something. It is a capability, right?
It's a dynamic capability of Vernunft.
Okay. Yeah.
If it's what Vernunft is for, this is to rise up to the heuristic level, to the mythic level, requires us to recognize that everything we try to do is in reality, every action we try to take involves a collision between the two infinities, the nature inside of us and the nature outside of us, and that both of them, each of them by itself, is a problem larger in scale than the human mind can manage, right? Because we're finite, but both of these problems are infinite. And we can't navigate what we ought to do unless we combine these two infinities, which is outside of our capabilities. So what we need is we need something other than a great machine that attempts to account for every detail, because that's too many details for us to keep track of. We need something that's normative and subjectively juicy, fascinating, interesting, unforgettable, and at the same time simulates the behavior of a principle by suggesting a great many true things in one juicy package. So this is the original purpose of mythos, is to seek out these telling paradigmatic examples that we can tell as stories, make it easy to remember some of the most important paths through the collision of these two infinities, the inner world and the outer world, to help us remember in times of trouble, how do we find our way? What's the most likely a good direction or a bad direction? And these are the sorts of things that can't be scripted out, but they can be suggested if we can, remember the key juicy stories.
It sounds like mythos, or the heuristes, is a faculty that it includes a descriptive function as well as a creative or inventive function.
Yes. It's definitely a creative, inventive function, and it's also it's a result of this isn't just like, it's not just storytelling, because it's the search for stories that help to illuminate particularly difficult problems and what to do about them. If it's just any old story, then it's just storytelling. But if it's the really difficult, juicy things that we all have to deal with, and it's been captured in an unforgettable form, that's myth making, right? Genuine myth making, as opposed to any tall tale telling or script writing or what have you.
It sounds very much like the Geist in Hegel, and maybe the Dionysian will in Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure. Well, those are great questions. Yeah, Kenneth Smith has some parables, paradigms, paradoxes in his books, Otherwise and Webs. He has some that talk about the Sphinx as a metaphor for myth making, and specifically the Sphinx. The riddles of the Sphinx are supposed to be the kinds of questions that first of all, they're difficult to answer. And second of all, the longer you work at them, the more they change the way you think. They strike right to the heart of the human condition. And he has one parable in which he talks about the myth as having the Sphinx has a gift for looking at a person and seeing immediately the weave of their mind, all their delusions and ideologies, all their subjectivities, and thinking of the question that if the Sphinx would ask that person that question, it would cause that person's world to just unravel. Their mind would dilate and they'd start to see reality in a way they never had before. To the Sphinx, the signature of the trap that somebody's mind is for them is obvious. They just see it at a glance. It's not even a challenge, to the Sphinx. And therefore, Sophocles' story in Oedipus Tyrannus that the Sphinx is just asking this one simple riddle that's not actually anything like what the Greek Sphinx would have asked. It's just that whatever the Sphinx would have asked would have been specific to Oedipus and would have unraveled his life. If you walked up to the Sphinx would ask you a different riddle, and it would be the one that would unravel your ideologies and worldviews, the trap of your mind. Which is this is an interesting kind of mythic level story because it gets you to think about the structure of the mind and the trap that it is for somebody, and how the trap is incredibly difficult for us as finite beings being immersed in the middle of it, but for a creature that had an infinite perspective, like this mythical Sphinx, it would be trivial to glance at any one of us and see what the issue is. What is it that's got us stuck in our head? This is an example of a story or a metaphor that has a more mythic component. It's closer to mythos than it is to ordinary storytelling. So it's getting us to ask the questions that we need to ask. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to remind the audience again, and I have mentioned this before, and when we're dealing with the question of mythos versus logos, and I asked myself the question, well, what was the mythic world, the world which existed prior to the age of Socrates or something like that? A world with different motives, but we have a measure of that world with us all the time, and that is in the dreaming faculty. Every night we dream, and if we look at the way our dreams operate, it seems a little bit crazy. It just doesn't function the way we think a logically ordered, rational mind should function. Because remember, folks, the important thing is the objective reality. Nothing else matters. Well, we know there are other things, but it's to be ignored. Only the objective reality counts. And that type of thought which is useful navigating the objective reality, only that matters. Now, dreams, we don't need that nonsense. Try to ignore it. But nevertheless, it's there. Nevertheless, us moderns, despite the fact that we want to exile it, still, almost all of us on a nightly basis, experience a mythic reality. It's still with us. It's still there. Like, it's like, the missing leg is still there. But the modern order is desperate to ignore the dreams. Oh, yeah, dreams happen. Dreams are just for discussions in women's magazines. And I mean, don't necessarily go into the detail or try and interpret it, but that essential thing that you're experiencing awareness from a completely different point of view that you do in daytime. And yet you're saying it doesn't matter, like it doesn't exist. But it does exist. But it doesn't exist. But actually it's there. Sorry, no, just ignore it. just ignore the elephant in the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, dreams are a classic example. That's a great one. And they have that riddle of the Sphinx quality in which your dream is, for despite the fact that we talk about dreams as though there's this eternal universal dream language, that in truth, at least my experience of dreaming and what I see with other people is that the dreams that you have are your mind's search for the juice in your mind, how to make you personally feel something, whether it's a fear dream or an excitement dream or a dream of triumph or a dream of shame. Your mind has the ability to locate where your shame is and construct a scenario that works specifically for you to make you feel an astonishing shame. And maybe if somebody else had that same dream, they wouldn't have felt ashamed at all, because that's not where their pool of shame lies. Your mind knows how to find your pool of shame. And thus the logic of the story is not in the noetic details of what happens, but is in the way that those were manipulated in order to get you into a situation where you could have this amazing feeling that your mind is trying to bring to life for you.
Actually, I would say you're still being that little bit reductionist, Rick. I get the feeling when the dreaming faculty starts that it's opening us up to another world. Remember that what we call the objective world might be only a narrow spectrum of the universe. As far as moderns go, that's we've got the 99.99% down. There might be a little smidgen we don't know about, but I might say, oh, you haven't even got 10% if you're lucky, and even that 10% is part of a suspect's view. And yeah, when I experience dreaming, it's like the mind is turning over. It's reversing itself. It's opening up, and that must be connected with something which is beyond the normal way we look at the world. We've categorized the world in a certain way, and we call that the objective reality. But much of it are our own categories.
Yes.
So there is this other world there. And it's not that I really want to be a fanatic about it. I'm tend to be more the rationalist. I'm far from what the person who would be fanatical about dreams. It's simply I can't stand the mentality which totally ignores it.
Exactly.
It wants to sweep it under the carpet.
Exactly.
So I would say dreaming is saying there's another world there that our normal objective appreciation doesn't really have a handle on.
Yeah. Yeah. When I talk about the purpose of dreams, and you're right, I'm being reductionistic, but let me rephrase it. When I talk about a purpose of dreams being to re-tap into those juices within you, part of what it's getting at is, what do you actually care about? Not what does your conscious mind care about, but you as a person, what do you actually care about? And Ganothi Seauton is warning us that among the things we don't know, if we don't know ourselves, among the things that we don't know about ourselves is what really matters to us. What are our actual connections to the world that would make us feel alive, going back to the Nietzschean dancing philosopher idea. And when we're dreaming, whatever the processes of the mind are that are happening, they have a much richer ability to get me to feel things than whatever my conscious mind is doing during the day. I mean, I have dreams in which I feel amazing things that I wake up and it fades away to just this kind of relatively gray level of engagement with life by comparison. So anyway, I'm with you. I mean, I think the result of that is, that you use the words another world. That's the idiom that's working for you. For me, the idiom is to get access to reality in a way other than the limited reality that my noetic side insists upon, to be able to relate to the world in a larger way than that. And by relating to the larger world, effectively parts of the world that my conscious mind was insisting on suppressing and overlooking are finally brought back into visibility where I can connect to them again. That's this idea that there's an infinite number of realities, not as in necessarily as in separate worlds, but just even if there's only one world, and I'm not insisting that there is, but even if there's just one, it's so infinite that any person's interpretation of that world projects just a teeny tiny slice of it, cutting out most of the information that's available in it. And so each of us is coming at it with a different one of these things, being able to break out of the limitations of what our noesis insists is true gives us access to so much more that it is as though there are multiple worlds, even if there's only the one, that there's so much information there to be accessed that that normally we just don't access. We just suppress it. It's hard to talk about these things. It sounds trite, but it's hard to do justice to the astonishing act of nescience that occurs in the act of paying attention. When our conscious mind pays attention to something, it is at the same time paying unattention to an infinite number of things that all get pushed into the background. And we take it for granted because we're so good at it, but that act, that involuntary act of suppression is erasing an infinite number of things in order to draw attention to the few things that our conscious mind wants to think about right now. That self-blinding is maybe necessary for the structure of conscious thought, but it doesn't stop becoming a self-blinding just because it's necessary. You know what I mean? The consequences of not seeing all those other things so that I can have this conversation with you, for example, those consequences are real. They include an enormous number of unintended consequences, regardless of what I think I'm accomplishing by actually focusing on you on this call. And dreaming, I love the way that dreaming gives you the ability to shake up that selection. And somehow your brain decides that it's okay now in this dreaming mode to stop erasing certain parts of reality that previously it was consistently insisting on erasing. And it's like, what do we see now that we couldn't see before? I go back to the peacock mantis shrimp, able to see all those colors we can't see. And I think it's that profound, the effect that it can have to shift your focus. I don't know. Speculating. Phil, come tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what I have on my mind is I think something that's related to this, but it might not seem so to you, but I'm going to tell it. It's about these two little girls that I end up watching videos of. One is quite understandable. The first one I'll describe is like I discovered her about 3 years ago in a musical context and violin. And she won the first prize, and what she played was just incredible for a 9-year-old at that time. And not only that, the technique of the fingering and hitting the right notes and very difficult notes, so that's technical. But the way she played it, she actually felt the music so deeply, and it was not just me. I mean, I understand music well enough to appreciate that. But the judges were judging, they were just astonished. One of them was just like going like this, like getting the rhythm correctly, and it's just incredible. I've since I watched some videos of her when she was 8 and 7 and even 6, and I recently saw a video of her. I was concerned because like I've seen so many children who are just incredible technicians at their age, but they just kind of fall apart, they fade away. And so I was concerned about that. But I recently heard a video of her when she was 11 years old, playing Max Brooks violin concerto. Max Brooks violin concerto is an incredibly deep concerto. It's like just slightly shy of like the three great concerto of Beethoven, Brahms, and Mendelssohn. Okay, but right on up there, you know. The only other one would be Sibelius's concerto. So, and she played it with such passion and such pathos. I'm saying, I'm not worried anymore because she actually understands the music in such a deep level. And I recently saw her, in fact, just today, I saw a video of her, like, because she's been accepted to the Curtis Institute of Music, you know, where Leonard Bernstein was studying as a child. So it's a very renowned school. She's a Japanese girl. Her name is Hamari Yoshiyama. And when she first began to ask a question, she didn't know how to say it. You know, she says, I just like to play music. It's something very simple. But now, like, she actually speaks fairly fluent English, and she speaks, you know, of course, Japanese, and she speaks fluent Italian. So she's a smart kid. And I heard the comments of her teachers who's teaching her, and they're astonished about her thing, and they're very careful that they're trying to nurture her and not to expose her too fast to the world in such a way, although she's being exposed quite fast to the world. So that I could understand. I love music, and she's just going to be a talent, and I'm afraid that I'll be dead, you know, before I could see her really mature and do the right thing. But nonetheless, I'm keeping track of that. The other girl was a little hard to explain. I just recently discovered her about 2 weeks ago. She's living alone. She's about my estimation is I don't know how old she is, but she looked like she's about 7 years old, living alone, taking care of herself. I still don't know what happened to her parents. And she's every day she does these very boring things like cooking. You know, I mean, like she lives in a little house, a tiny little thing that, you know, it's just not well built, but she would get the firewood, she would wash the dishes, all those stuff. Okay. And then she would go out, and usually she would either go pick fruits from the wild, or, you know, get clams from the wild or something of that sort. Or she would work with some farmers who she knows, and she would buy fruit from them and things of that sort. And she would go into the small town. It's a little bit bigger than a village because there's a little store there, and she would sell things, you know, in a very friendly way. And she would give them money, you know. I mean, they would give her money, and she would give them change, you know. Like, in other words, she's just very honest and fair, hardworking. It's just incredible. I'm just thinking to myself, why am I watching this girl? Because she's mostly doing just regular things, not exposing like any special talent in like music, you know, something of that sort. But the way she pursues life, it's just it's just sort of so magnetizing, because it's so honest and downright virtuous in her own way. And I'm thinking, but I've seen her cook before. I've seen this, like, pretty much the same thing, you know, like I've seen her pick fruit and other things. And the way she carries herself with a kind of, I guess, self-acknowledgement and dignity and pride. And I just wonder, like, she's operating in that world which she knows, and she's very authentic in that world. And I'm thinking, like, but she's not going to have the opportunity Hamari Yoshiyama has, because she doesn't have that culture that supports her in that sense. But the culture that's there, I mean, they're not like doling out money, like a charity. She works for it, doing her own thing, creating a market thing. And when she has to buy things, clothes and food for herself when she cooks. And so like she's operating in that way that it's like very authentic relationship with others. And so I thought, yeah, maybe there's something deep within her understanding of how the world is within what's available to her. She's doing well. And like 7 years, I can't even imagine to begin with a 7-year-old kid taking care of herself, And there was one time when she was selling and a rainstorm came up and she out in the rain, she finally went across the street, which was sort of empty at that time. There was a lot and some boys were playing and and riding the bicycles, and she was sitting there and finally a boy came up and offered her to give her a ride on a bicycle, and then that was good. And then he actually taught her how to ride a bicycle. I said, for the first time I got to see her actually be a child. I said, God, like here is a kid that not only does she have violin lessons, she didn't get to be a child. And it was just so much fun to watch her like play hide and seek, during the rainstorm. It's like, it's just incredible. So I think it has something to do with human existence. Even though the two live very different lives, they were very authentic to what they were doing. Okay. And I think that's why I bear watching like her doing typically pretty boring stuff, picking fruit, doing this and that in different landscape, but it's like still like she does it so earnestly. It's like it's magnetizing in a funny way, So I just thought that relates to what we're talking about, the human dimension in existence, and how you have to deal with life as what is given to you, that's available to you with the best you can, with authenticity who you are. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's interesting to try to, as we dig into this material, it's interesting to try to imagine what exactly it would be like to occupy one of these other worldviews. As part of the struggle he's inviting us to in this book. What would our experience of life be like if we had the medieval worldview and we were sitting right where we are now, looking about the things around us and reacting to it? It would be different. It would feel different. Things would take on a different charge than they do now for us because we're encapsulated within the modernist worldview. And obviously in chapter 4, our focus is on the ancient worldview, but there's others as well. And we only know of these three. These are the three that we've traced so far. But we know there are others. We know there have been other people who have been around for a long time, and that there are different ways to weight and interpret the faculties of the mind as they give us access to parts of what's happening in nature around us. There's a Kent Nerburn book. It's the third in a trilogy. I've talked about the first ones before. I talked about Neither Wolf Nor Dog, I think, which was his experience dealing with a Lakota elder and learning from him. And then he wrote The Wolf at Twilight. But the third one is called The Girl Who Sang to the Buffalo. And it's like what you were talking about. It's a story about his interactions with a young Lakota girl who's born with the gift that you don't see very often anymore in the modern world, of really connecting to reality and to nature in ways that modern society doesn't approve of, doesn't reward, tries to stamp out of people. The story is set up early in the book that he's being called in to help because Indian Health Service wants to put her on drugs to suppress her behavior, to make her normal. Yeah, but the Lakota don't want that, because the way that she pays attention to the world around her is the way that they associate, with their classic medicine men doing, where they are able to disregard things that matter to modern society in order to focus on things that we don't value, and to really hone in on them and connect to them. So it includes this classic scene where she is surrounded by buffalo and is singing to them, not the way that a person would sing to another person, but where she's really focused on what they're feeling and the mood that they have and their sense of being a herd, what connects them to each other. And she's trying to relate to them through musical notes. And they, all look at her and they all surround her and stare at her. And the people who are watching are freaking out because this doesn't look safe. She's a little girl, surrounded by these giant beasts that could trample her. But they also don't understand why they're not trampling her. What's happening in this, how can any of this be happening? And this is a, not entirely fictional. This is a semi-documentary, semi-fictional story. But it's an attempt to portray, in part, it shows how hard it would be for somebody with an heuristic worldview, with a mythic mind, to get along in the modern world, because the institutions of society would be intervening at every age to try to fix you, because obviously you're broken. If you won't pay attention to paying your bills, if you won't pay attention to obeying the teacher, if you won't do all of following the policeman's orders, if you won't do all these things that we take for granted because we've been doing them for so long we don't even notice anymore. But if you weren't interested in those things, but you were keenly interested in other things that society puts no value in, you would be constantly bumping up against the parts of society that are used to enforce its norms in a way that the rest of us don't notice. It's one way, that story is one way to sort of make tangible this claim that Kenneth Smith has, that modernity is partly about characterological genocide. It's partly about suppressing the development of Aristoi, and that it's hard for us to imagine that because of our self-definition as modern and free and advanced and so forth. But as he says, if you want to understand a system, you have to pay attention, at least as much attention, to what it won't say and won't let you think as you do to what it does say and what it says you should think. What is in the lacunae, because that's the part of reality that's suppressed, and it's not suppressed for no reason. That suppression plays a function. So with the suppression of the mythic mind, the function is losing the ability to care enough to get in the way, right? Losing that charge. Achilles in the modern world would be in trouble almost immediately, right? Odysseus would be in trouble almost immediately. Anybody who has, some part of the Socrates, anybody who has some part of the heuristic urge in them enough to force them to act would get into trouble almost instantly. Within a few days, they'd be in trouble, if not sooner, because of the way we structured things. Anyway, Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh yeah, I was giving was it Gilbert Murray a little bit of a read, the 5 stages of Greek religion or something like that. I'm up to the first part. He makes an interesting claim that, for example, we view the wind as a mechanical process. We go to school, we get taught there's this big thing called the atmospheric system. The sun heats everything up and we get the wind. Simple, a bit like putting a Bunsen burner on something, that's how it works. But now Gilbert Murray's claiming that ancients would be convinced that the wind was intentional. Something has thrown the wind in a certain way intentionally, as we've what's his name, the Greek king who sacrificed his daughter so that he could take his ships to Troy. So it's a question, if the wind's given me a hard time, can I sacrifice things to the wind to make it change its mind? But yeah, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about how in ancient times awareness functioned differently. Well, we have to judge it now. Who's right? The modern who says that the wind is simply a mechanical process we can investigate in the classroom, science, or the wind, it's intentionally, the wind is intentionally driving my ship towards that rocky coast. Who can I throw overboard to appease the god of the wind? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, it's you get weird counter-rational conclusions when you start to adopt an organism as the metaphor for everything. If the wind is not just an object or a machine, if it's an organism, it must be trying to do something. All organisms act with a teleology. So what is it that the wind wants? And there are literalistic ways to interpret that, which can result in, well, maybe it wants my daughter, but there are more complex ways to interpret that, which is what it wants might not be something I have control over. It still matters, and I still need to understand it because it's going to affect my life. It's a divinity of sorts, right? The winds were all treated as divinities because for a people that depended so much on sea trade, the wind, was a big deal. If it's not blowing the way you want, you're in some serious trouble. Effectively, I live on the Pacific Coast. I live in Seattle and Puget Sound, and almost all of our weather comes from the ocean. It's like a massive, endless conveyor belt drawing in the next marine layer of clouds. And we occasionally get the big fluffy clouds the rest of the world gets, but it's almost always the low gray clouds that are thinking about rain and haven't decided whether they're rain or not. But if they do rain, they're not going to be a giant thunderstorm with, massive downpours like people do in Hollywood films. It's going to be drizzle, and lots of drizzle. So there's this conveyor belt, and, you can live your life in Seattle ignoring what the wind is going to do, but considering how often it's wet out, if you want to have any kind of outdoor life at all, you have to start paying attention to what the wind is doing and which way it's going and what it's bringing or not bringing with it. As an outdoors person, I like hiking a lot up in the mountains, but I got to always be watching what's on the wind's mind today, right? What's it up to? So, in a sense, this hasn't really changed. In middle modernity, classic modernity, they did just treat it like like a machine or like an object, or it's just a force. But that was also the era when we had conspicuously bad weather prediction, right? I mean, remember, as bad as weather prediction is now, remember how bad it was when we were kids? I mean, the newsman was the most pitiable of the anchors on the news show because, half the stuff that came out of his mouth, you couldn't trust it. It's like, well, it's going to rain today. Well, nope, didn't rain. Okay, it's going to be sunny tomorrow. Nope, it rained tomorrow. It's like the success rate was like marginally better than flipping a coin. And the way they got over that was they had to develop AI systems, modeling systems that modeled the larger picture of what the wind was doing and why it was doing it, until they started to model the intentions of the wind, the reasons, the intelligence underlying what was happening. They weren't able to predict it at all. And now it's not bad, right? I mean, most of the time, if it says there's a 70% chance of rain today, it is in fact probably going to rain today, which was not always the case when I was a kid. But it has required moving away from treating the wind as a machine or an object and moving more towards getting to the larger picture of, well, what's on the wind's mind? What's going on in the larger picture? What's the Pacific Ocean doing right now? And I think that's telling. There's a way in which mechanistic object-based models for reality work best when the thing that you're trying to model is just dead simple. Billiard balls on a pool table. Physics is not bad when you're talking billiard balls on a pool table. Or one guy with a rope and a pulley. That's pretty good. One nuclear bomb. We could pretty much do that. But you start getting massively complex systems. Thousands, millions, billions, trillions of things interacting. And physics is just wretched at that. I mean, we're not good at that. We're just really not good at that. Because the big numbers don't lend themselves to
a dynamic system.
Dynamic systems, right? The big numbers don't lend themselves to that kind of mechanical accounting of every single factor and adding up all the forces.
Nietzsche turned his back on physics in a sense and went over to the dynamic system, which was Leibniz. Leibniz was dynamism,
calculus,
and monadism can be translated as perspectivism. In other words, there's one thing which is truly unique with us all. I might be product-wise, I might have something in common or similar to all the other humans, but what is definitely my own is my perception at any point in time or space. That is uniquely my own.
Yeah.
It's my perspective.
Yeah, and it's interesting how much emerges from these kind of whole system effects. So I've been reading about oak trees. In the Pacific Northwest, we have one native oak, the Oregon white oak. None of the rest are native. And I need to plant a tree in our backyard along the edge of the backyard because in the summer, with global warming, it gets hot back there. It's actually cooking and killing some of the plants next to the patio. The two-story flat back wall facing south combined with a cement patio, it bounces the heat around back there. And as the day gets on, it gets hotter and hotter until it becomes like an oven. And the blueberry plants planted along it start wilting and dying. And they're just, I can't water them enough. They're just too hot. So I'm going to put a tree back there. And I've been researching what's a local tree that I could plant. And I'm increasingly thinking about one of these Oregon white oaks. They'll live for 500 years. It'll grow to over 100 foot tall. And I'm reading how to plant them and what makes them thrive or not thrive. And one of the huge changes from when I was a kid, they were obsessed with fungicides, right? You're supposed to kill off all the fungus that might parasitize the oak. But during my lifetime, they've come to understand that when they were doing that, they were creating trees that couldn't thrive because those trees were never intended to live in isolation. They're intended to have their roots penetrated by the hyphae of a fungal network. And the fungal network is supposed to be out there collecting water and minerals and trading it to the tree in exchange for glucose generated by the leaves of the tree. And that trade makes the tree thrive in a way that it simply can't thrive without that hyphal network. Roots are just not as effective at collecting minerals and water as hyphae are. Hyphae are far more, filamentary, fine-grained, small. And plus, fungi have amazing kind of chemical factory capabilities. They're able to do a lot more chemical manipulation of their environment than a tree root is. So the advice today is that if you are, going to transplant a tree, an oak tree, or if you're going to plant an oak tree, even if you're going to plant an oak tree from scratch, you could get a young oak tree, it's only 4 or 5 years old and you want to plant it in your yard. They say find an existing white oak tree and dig up some of the dirt from near its roots and put that into the soil that you plant your new tree into. And that'll carry with it some of the hyphae network of the fungus, which will then spread and inoculate the root system of the oak, and it'll thrive better. It's more likely to survive. That is, we're now having to do precisely the opposite of what we were taught to do when I was a kid, because what we learned is trying to treat an oak tree as a single object was a terrible, terrible mistake. It can only really thrive in this larger, complex context that it needs, but that we used to try to destroy in our attempt to purify things and make them obey our law of individual objects that we had in our mind. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what's on my mind is the wind notion. I mean, it was a story that, in a sense, my first thought was what happened in D-Day. You know, they had trouble predicting the weather, and finally they say there might be a short window that we could launch the D-Day. You know, and Eisenhower had to say, well, let's go with it because it seemed like the weather will remain bad for quite a while, and it was like by then the Germans will surely know that something is coming up already, you know. So let's go with it. So decisions have to be made. So that was interesting. It's like, and it's reminded me in a sense the song "You Can Never Go Home Again" in a dynamic system, because by the time you go home again, the river will have changed, as Heraclitus says. So therefore, I've always thought, you know, like living at the gates is good because you can't reject the contemporary society. You live in it. So all you could do in a sense is to marginalize it to a certain degree by understanding other systems, and so that you're both inside and outside of the system you're in. I mean, could you imagine, let's say I myself hate the capitalist system, but I work within it. I can't avoid it. I guess I could move through the mountains of, you know, like Montana or whatever, and just try to live by myself, you know, dig up roots and all that. But that's not me. I mean, maybe that's somebody else, you know, who would be willing to do that. And so, therefore, in a sense, you have to constantly equivocate between various systems so that you understand that there's something broader than the one you're stuck in. But nonetheless, you're stuck in it. You know, as I said, that little girl, she's never going to learn how to play violin, but she does an honest life, you know, and that's good, and that's almost magnetic to me in a funny way. So I think the fact that you remind yourself of a dynamic system, and you are dynamic too, you're always going forward, whether you like it or not, you know, because the river will push you there. And so therefore, in a sense, you have to be within the system itself. You can't just reject it. You can criticize it and do all sorts of things and try to live around it. But, you know, you're living in a border state. That's my metaphor, you know, and it's good to know. I mean, if you're in San Diego, you can't help but have some understanding of Mexico. You can't. You could try to, I guess, live in a gated community, try your best not to eat Mexican food or whatever, but you just can't do it. It's everywhere. So therefore, you have to just accept the fact that there is always some integration of some sort in that sense. So living in the borderlands is good. It reminds you, you know, you're not at the center, and other things affect you as well as the culture that you live in. So there you are. That's it. That's sort of my response, and I'm glad he told that story, because it just because my first thought was like, you know, I'd be willing to go against all kind of things, but I don't know about sacrificing a person to please the gods. You know, I mean, we're back to Abraham all over again. You know, and remember, even there, God says, "Oh, just kidding, just kidding. You don't have to sacrifice Jacob after all." So, all right, that's it, Phil.
Well, of course, the Agamemnon and Iphigenia story, the you know, it really comes into focus when we add the rest of the story. And the rest of the story is that Artemis was pissed off at Agamemnon for doing that. In other words, he read the wind wrong. Yes, it's true that after he sacrificed his daughter, then the wind came up and the ships were able to launch, but he was punished by death for having done that. His wife murders him, right? And it's well seen as deserved injustice. And in the Iphigenia story with Artemis, she saves Iphigenia unbeknownst to Agamemnon, and she gets to live out her life. I can't remember if it's as a priestess of Artemis or what, but so the gods did not agree with Agamemnon's assessment about what was going on with the wind. He took a very literal, direct assessment, right? He said, you know, it must want some simple thing, and I'm going to give it this simple though painful thing. And, you know, and then when conditions changed, he assumed that he had made them. He had brought that about himself and made that change, and therefore the gods must be pleased. But the gods were not pleased. Agamemnon pays with his life, right? So, you know, this is another version. This is a less admirable version of the Oedipus story. It's like, you know, he's doing his best, but Agamemnon is not as cool a dude as Oedipus was, and so he makes a more obvious blunder and pays for it in a more obvious way. And again, that's us, right? Trying to read nature and its intentions and utterly blowing it. So again, let's what I wanted to do today is look at this ramp up to mythos and logos and how we got here. We talked about nature as becoming. We talked about nature as intrinsic truth. That's section A. Section B, custom and nature, aristocracy and philosophy. So in part, we're talking there about the difference between the nature outside of us and the nature inside of us, and how the nature inside of us makes us dependent upon culture to an enormous account. You know, in a way that no other animal is. They have cultures, but they aren't as dependent on them as we are. Culture is our stupid pet trick. We need to be finished. We're an animal that has that big yearning to be filled in, and to find its place in the world, and that, you know, the diversity of cultures mean there's all kinds of possibilities for how that can turn out. It gives us this ability to be incredibly variable, but that variation not only makes possible excellence, it also makes possible, you know, horrific outcomes. We can be better than the animals, but we can also be worse than the animals. We're not automatically above them the way that so many people claim. We're, you know, they at least have their place in the world that they have evolved to, that they're going to tend to be in balance in. We have, deliberate isn't the right word, but our evolution has sabotaged us in order to open up our freedom. And that sabotage makes it possible for us to be either better or worse, but almost never the same. And so this leads to the kind of aristocracy, this idea of, if you've got this enormous variability, it's incredibly important that you be working to promote the good side of the outcomes and not the bad side of the outcomes. You gotta not be value neutral on the variability of human beings. You gotta be engaging in anthropoculture and paideia and trying to do what you can to tip the scales away from everybody eating each other and destroying everything, you know, because that's a possibility. People have destroyed their own civilizations and families and each other plenty of times, you know, throughout the evolution of human cultures. So, you know, there is an enormous amount at stake for us, and it requires an enormous amount of attention. Thus, custom and nature, aristocracy, and philosophy. This whole area of philosophy, the need to critique the range of human behavior to distinguish the wiser from the fooler, the healthier from the sicker. It's a critical need for the human animal in a way that it's much less of a need for any other animal. You know, we as a creature that is semi-programmable through culture, we need philosophy so that there is a way to discriminate among cultures. You know, or more importantly, you know, to discriminate, you know, healthy culture, intentional culture from, you know, chaotic, destructive outcomes that would be possible otherwise. So Section C, form and matter, organicism, arete. We build on this further, and this gets this distinction between form and matter. What are the possibilities within the matter? What could it become? What's the natural lawfulness of the matter that restricts what you can shape it into and what you can't shape it into, and how you can shape it and how you cannot shape it. And then on the other side of the picture, form, the imposition of order upon matter like that, and the way that the Greek gods are subservient to nature, are aspects of nature, because they can't and don't override the lawfulness of the matter itself. They have to work within the constraints of the matter. And in this, you're seeing the more limited conception of the divine that the ancients had compared to the medievals. The medieval revolution is the transcendental revolution that says, no, we have a divine form so potent that the matter puts no restrictions whatsoever upon the creative faculties of our divinity. Our divinity can make something out of nothing, ex nihilo. And even if he's not working ex nihilo, he could make anything out of you. And so in this, we're seeing this struggle between kind of the ancient conception that there are limits to your free will, that you have to grow within the rules and lawfulness of your character, which would be a more ancient perspective, versus the medieval perspective that at any moment you could be saved. At any moment, your entire character could be overthrown. Your daimon could be cast out like a demon and replaced with Jesus Christ, who will now fill you up with goodness in a way that just a second before you were completely incapable of. This concept of a disruptive miracle that can break all the laws goes hand in hand with the concept of a God who's not bound by nature's laws. And it causes a change in the way that we understand human intelligence and willfulness. What should we want? What is possible? What should we be working towards? It makes a huge difference which interpretation you have. So here again, we sort of get at this difference between, is the world made up of passive objects waiting for human beings to come along and assign them meaning and impose our will upon them to organize them as we see fit? Or is the cosmos made up of nested organisms within organisms within organisms that are all teleologically working to express their inner character, in which case there are limits to what we can get them to do, and there are limits to what we can get ourselves to do. There are ways we can grow and ways we can't grow. It creates a picture of a complex world that requires a sophisticated intelligence to come to understand and to be able to interact with, right? Rather than looking for a simple salvation, we're having to look to really dig and explore. And of course, he puts arete here, and arete leads into the next section. This idea of diversity and what are the specific gifts that each organism has that distinguish it from the other organisms. And so if we're going to make a culture, do we want to make a culture of clones that are all interchangeable gears that all have the same capabilities? Or are we wanting to make a culture of diverse people with diverse talents, in which each person's talents are given the best possible opportunities to grow to the furthest, because that way those gifts become the gifts for the culture? Whereas if we're just homogenizing and trying to create a gray swill of interchangeable people, then we're cutting off, all of the excellences that could have been available to that culture in our attempt to enforce a mediocre equivalence. And bound up with this are questions of ethics, right? Do we treat other people well because they are precise mirrors of ourselves, because we're all the same? Is it only if people are equal that they deserve to be treated well? Or do people deserve to be treated well even if they're highly diverse? Can we have an ethics that can handle different aretes and pull them together to create a whole out of them? This goes fundamentally to these questions of these different epochs and their different ideas about what a person is and how they fit into the world. So from the concept of natural excellence, or arete, and the diversity and the gifts that are there. Oh, before I go on, let me call on Donald, because he's got something to add. Go ahead, sir.
not really, but I've been reading some Arendt from Between Past and Future, her essay on education, where, Phil often says, from Heidegger, that we are thrown into this world. And Arendt makes the observation, well, we're the ones that throw people into this world. They're our children. This doesn't just happen willy-nilly, that people pop into existence being thrown into the world. But then she makes the further observation that if you are not willing to introduce the people who you throw into the world to the world, you should not be allowed to have children or to be an educator of children. There are certain requirements in the introduction, for the introduction of a thrown person, in order to enter the world and have a chance at becoming a human being. It's just, you've mentioned, you've talked about, you've touched on this so much in the last few minutes that I just wanted to bring it, because you were paralleling kind of what Arendt was going. She has a different aspect to everything, but it was, how do people get thrown into the world, and what are the responsibilities of the people that throw them into it?
Thank you, Donald. Yeah. Duty and responsibility, right? Major themes that are implicit in all of this. And of course, yeah, Kenneth Smith worked his way through Hannah Arendt's work. That's just like we can see the Heraclitus and we can see the Nietzsche in this, or we can see the Hegel. The more you look at Hannah Arendt and come back to Kenneth Smith, the more you can see Hannah Arendt. Just the filaments, the hyphae of Hannah Arendt's, are throughout all of this writing, throughout these themes. And so this duty of paideia to raise the next generation in a healthful direction is part and parcel of this ancient perspective. And of course, that's at odds with the modern perspective. The modern perspective is nothing means anything. You can do whatever you want. We're all free. And by that freedom, it means we are not bound by things like morality, right and wrong, obligation. No, we're free, because all those things would be tethers. And this is, Nietzsche critiques this, right? Nietzsche, loves to dig at, and well, so does Kafka, at these questions of, well, what are the implications of the modernist obsession with not being bound by anything, with being 100% perfectly free, as though that were possible? And they're all sick. The consequences are ill. They're not good. That ethics are only possible where there is a sense of duty and obligation at a minimum. But also the Greeks thought, shame, pity. If you're not moved subjectively by such things, then you're not going to respond correctly to situations that demand your action. So this very concept of differential excellences and diversity, this concept that there's an enormous at stake between the best that human beings can achieve and the worst that they might sink to, and the need to put our thumbs on the damn scale and push with all our might to try to create a better outcome out of this potential chaos. This is just rife throughout the ancient perspective, and it's almost wholly absent from the modernist perspective, which is so pragmatic and utilitarian that it can lend itself to anything. I mean, yeah, you could make a modernist utopia, but it is every bit as easy, and maybe a lot easier, to make a modernist dystopia, because modernism, there's no there when it comes to, it refuses to put its thumb on the scales, of whether things are going to turn out well or ill. And because it refuses to put its thumb on the scales in its obsession with objectivity, the result is that anybody with bad intentions who comes along finds that the scales do not resist him when he pushes them in a negative direction to achieve his own short-term goals at the cost of long-term survival for humanity. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, thanks, Donald, for bringing that point up about the responsibility of throwing people into the pit, so to speak. There's a kind of an answer to that in a way. Of course, we all have responsibility for doing that. And part of that is answered by Muhammad Yunus, right? Muhammad Yunus, the guy who won the Nobel Peace Prize maybe back about 15, 20 years ago, because he started the micro banking thing. I mean, it's now degenerated into something else, but the original thing was to give small loans to people, really people who are poor, well, actually destitute. And he, by and large, only gave it to women. Very few times did he give it to men, because he knew that men would just go and get drunk and use it up. But women were always thinking about the children. I mean, by and large, I can't say that every woman does that, but they seem to be tied to the children a lot more, because they seem to always be very careful about how to use it. Like at that time, buying cell phones and renting it out to people so they could make some money and then provide food for their kids and maybe even send their kids to school. And so it was a very small amount, and they always paid it back. Well, almost always. I can't say that it's always. Almost always paid it back. So there was an honest system there that took care of throwness to a much greater degree than men would. I mean, I'm a man. I don't want to feel guilty for everything men do, but I do feel a little bit of guilt that I am in that category. So in some sense, I think, yeah, we are responsible. We always hear about deadbeat dads. We don't hear so much about deadbeat moms, although I'm sure there are some. But nonetheless, I think there's something about women's being more attached to kind of emotional well-being of others that, in a sense, I think that's a virtue that we need in the world a bit more than we have, rather than going to war and whatever. Which, by the way, I'm not totally against war either, but sometimes it's necessary. But it's like maybe we have a little too much of it in some sense, and not for the right reason. So yeah, there's a partial answer. The other partial answer actually to me came from Peter Zion, who's a global strategist. He says what happened is back, let's say 100 years ago, 150 years ago, people used to all live in the farm. And when you live in the farm, you have a lot of kids because they were in essence free labor, And so you have as many kids as you want to, except for as many and plus one, and then you realize that you had too many. So you had a lot of kids, and then they work, But when you move in the city and you live in, let's say, a high-rise tower, and a condominium, kids are an expense. So what happened is the development of the middle class, it's a little different in America, but in a lot of places, the space, people have a lot less kids. Take a look at Japan or China or Korea, and all that. Is like suddenly you have a depopulation problem because, I think China may have something like 1.1 kid per woman, which you need at least 2 or 2.1 as a replacement population. So there's also a impersonal way that people make decisions about responsibility, because it's just too much responsibility to have all those kids that you have to put through school. You have a very small condominium up at the 4th floor, or 10th floor. And it's like, yeah, I just can't afford it, And plus, there's a certain amount of, when you get a little bit richer, you like to have a yacht, and kids are going to stand in the way. And so all those things come together. That's also impersonal as all kind of economics. So that's the other part of the answer. So that's interesting. So it's both nothing personal, it's just business, and also something very personal, like, we have responsibility. So yeah, one of the reasons I don't have kids is I was too passionate in art. I knew I was a bit too selfish to spend the time I need to actually have a kid. So I became as good of uncle as I could be, but that's different from being a father. So we'll leave it there. That's it. Phil, thanks for your question. That was a very, very important question.
Thanks, Phil. So that was D, arete or natural excellence. And what does that lead to? It leads to E, daimon, eudaimonia, and really he should have said and dysdaimonia as well. So because one of Kenneth's, it's fairly widespread in philosophical students of ancient Greek society, the recognition that the Greeks had these concepts of daimon and eudaimonia. But as Kenneth says, he says there was, of course, obviously also the concept of dysdaimonia, but an enormous number of classicists argue with him on this point, and they tell him that he can't prove it. And since he can't prove it, they didn't have it. Only the things that he can prove they had, did they have. And, he says, Aristotle may not have used precisely the word dysdaimonia, but he did everything but, and so did Plato. They describe plenty of examples of dysdaimonia. And he says, and that's where the name Desdemona in Shakespeare's Othello comes from, is a modern rendition of dysdaimonia. But certainly when you look at what the concept of daimon and eudaimonia is about, it's obvious that the Greeks would have believed in dysdaimonia because they believed, as Heraclitus said, that the bad are many and the good are few. that are the problem for us is that even though supposedly there might be an infinite number of ways in which a human being, thanks to this evolutionary freedom, could behave good, there are also an infinite number of ways in which we could behave bad. These are large numbers. They sort of abstractly feel like they balance out, but when we actually watch the way people behave, we see that there are far more ways to go wrong than there are to go right. That is to say, what we see in the tragedies is if you're missing even one of the virtues, that missing virtue becomes the story of your life. Your tragedy is, what is the one thing that you needed that you were missing? And because of its absence now, all of the following consequences took place. But to have a good outcome, assuming that's possible for a human being, requires therefore that all of the virtues are firing, at least in some kind of balance. And that predisposes the scales in the direction of making it very easy to end badly and very difficult to end well. And this is where the ethics of anthropoculture and paideia come from, that say we have to even the scales. We have to even the scales by stacking the deck in the favor of people developing good character instead of bad character, healthy character, to be able to succeed in the world, and so that their gifts, their aretes, can be cultivated for the good of humanity. That requires this. So they get into this idea about the dependency between free will and determinism around the concept of the daimon, which we've talked about many times, about the way that your character is so authoritative over the choices you're able to make that it functions like a deity over you. It's the simplest metaphor is that it has authority over you. And if you want a better outcome, you better invest in changing your character, cultivating your character. Not that you can make it do whatever you want because of the rules of form and matter we've talked about before, but rather that within the restrictions of the character that you have now, there's some scope for cultivation. And wherever that is, that's where you should be pushing. You have to study yourself and learn yourself to figure out where the opportunities are to improve yourself. And as you improve in those areas, your character changes. And then that may open up new avenues for improvement that weren't possible before because they were closed off because of that underdeveloped faculty. So this whole concept of daimon as, on the one hand, character is fate, which is the simple translation of ethos, anthropoi, daimon. But on the other hand, daimon is freedom, because if you want more freedom, you have to invest in your daimon. You have to do the work on your character to create the new scope of freedom that you didn't have before. And that, because that's the limiting factor, it's the bottleneck for your access to freedom, it means that working on, studying and practicing the discipline of the virtues that will dilate your character becomes an obligation, an ethical obligation, right? If we don't do that, we're effectively cutting off access to being a better person for ourselves. We'll never know who we could develop into because we failed to invest in that work. And the same is then true at an educational level, like you were talking about, Phil. You want to really be spreading around that kind of work on character, that consciousness of the issue of character, and that work on helping people to develop past their current generation of limitations so that they can have new possibilities that weren't otherwise open to them. This is all part of putting your thumb on the scales to try to even out and get better outcomes percentage-wise for the human population than would happen by default. Now, by the Hellenistic period, post-Hellenic period, after what Gilbert Murray in 5 Stages in Greek Religion calls the loss of nerve, Greek society became fatalistic. As a result of the many civil wars that happened, starting with the Peloponnesian War, they lost faith in the ancient ethos and worldview as they had known it before, and they started to give in to fatalism, and they got into fortune telling and astrology, and part of what all of that was about was attempting to mathematically predict your character by reading the stars, and then that would tell you what was possible and not possible for your character. And of course, since it's just a calculation, it's like a trivial-minded noetic approach to gnothe seauta. That is, rather than having to put in a lifetime of work to study yourself, we'll just do some math on the stars when you were born, and that'll give us the answer. And hand in hand with that kind of mechanistic fatalism came this concept that if you were lucky enough to be born with a good daimon, you had eudaimonia. If you were unlucky enough to be born with a bad daimon, you had dysdaimonia, and oh well, too bad. They sort of got away from this concept of molding your character and working on it. They sort of embraced this fatalistic side of it. And it's certainly truly part of Heraclitus's conception that if you don't put in the work on your character, then it is fatalistic. Your character is going to determine what you do. You are going to just be a symptom. But what's missing from that later Hellenistic understanding is that if you do put in the work on your character, then it's not fatalistic. That is because the thing that is fatalistically determining your outcomes, or at least the agency side of your outcomes, when an agency versus contingency clash, that can be a moving target that you can move within the constraints of the matter of your character. You could change your fate by changing your character. This was part of the archaic understanding of this complex set of relationships. And the stage in a civilization at which it begins to abandon the hard work of character development is the point at which the society loses its limberness, its adaptability, its capacity to generate new creative insights. And because people become more and more rigidly who they already were, because they're refusing to do the work to change themselves. And thus it becomes more and more mechanistic and entropic. What happens to a civilization? This is jumping ahead, this is the conundrum for modernity, that we are trying to suppress the development of the mythic mind, trying to suppress the development of Aristoi, because they are unpredictable, because they are these creative fountains that can generate new, unexpected, and sometimes very difficult to control behavior. And so by suppressing them, we're able to make people more predictable. And therefore our PR campaigns, our marketing campaigns, our systems of control, they're more likely to succeed at getting people to do what we want them to do, because people are more like each other. They're more predictable, right? But the downside of doing that is that the result is a society that's less and less creative and more rigid, and that makes it more and more actually modelable through entropy, rather than through growth. Growth, life is great, and it's the fountain of youth, but it's also unpredictable. So the point at which you become more obsessed with being able to predict how you can control your pools of wealth is the point at which you start turning away from life towards death as a culture, right? You remove the risky, dangerous creativity, and it all starts to ossify. Joseph, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it's an interesting way, actually, that you just described it there with how it becomes more mechanistic, our interactions, when we're not necessarily focused on our character, because then things become much more transactional in nature. And, once they become much more transactional, there's this devolving of like the social fabric of, for people to actually get along with one another, because there's a lot that goes into the idea that not only are you managing your character for yourself, but you're also, you start to have a degree of understanding that acting in your interest, acting in someone, acting for the greater good or pursuing what is good is actually something that works for both parties, as opposed to looking at it from a strictly mechanistic, transactional perspective. And, it also has a lot of other negative connotations, is that if you don't do the introspective work, and you don't necessarily challenge your personal demons, that you will have less empathy for the individuals that are around you, because that obviously you're not taking on, your own personal demons. Therefore, when it comes to assessing someone else, that you're automatically going to judge them harshly, because basically you have a false sense of self that results in a certain anger, especially if this anger is something that is being harnessed and you don't know exactly what it is, and so it impacts our relationships in a number of different ways. When you're talking about managing our character, it's our personal relationships, our societal relationships, and I mean, I know you talked a little bit about being social earlier, and that's a big part of that. That this is while it's an individual journey, it's an individual journey to look inwards, to act out, and I think that's this is an important part of kind of what Kenneth is saying. And I think that it isn't something that you have to manage yourself towards principles, not towards statistical means. And so I think that's where you can start to ask the questions to yourself that are actually meaningful if you're managing yourself towards principles. And that's why I see the importance of virtue. And it's not an intellectual exercise. That's the other important point. It's a intellectual and moral exercise, meaning that a lot of people know what the right thing is to do or the right way to behave, but they intellectually know, but they don't necessarily act that way. And so, and not that we're all not guilty of, not, failing ourselves. I mean, like, I've fallen pretty hard in certain circumstances. So I fully am aware of that. But I recognize that. And that's important, because if I didn't recognize that, I'd be pretty angry. And so that's just some of the reasons as to why I think this section is actually, I'm looking forward to this section, because we can dig into this on a number of different levels. from both a psychological perspective, neurological perspective, and philosophical perspective. Anyway, those are just some thoughts, but I really did like it, how you characterized it as, the way we if we manage ourselves in a mechanistic way, I really believe things become much more transactional.
Thanks for bringing that up, Joseph. That's, I like your use of the zero sum. You mentioned zero sum, and that's a major element here. The more we kind of regularize ourselves and perform according to scripts and rules and laws, working within a system and not questioning the system, the more because things shift from vitalistic to entropic, there's less value around. And so we become more concerned about the dwindling resources and more focused on taking them from other people before they take them from us. The older model of abundance, where you focus on activities that grow the pie, that generate more resources around you, more than anybody could possibly use, that gets people switched back into cooperative mode. This is the thing that Robert Axelrod talks about in his short books about cooperation. He says, Homo sapiens has this switch in our limbic system where under the right conditions, we can be very creative and cooperative. When we feel safe, when we feel like there's enough to go around and we're not under pressure, we can become more creative and we can share more and empathize more. But most people, unless they're inoculated against it, most people, if circumstances change and there doesn't seem to be enough to go around, that limbic system engages, fight or flight, or etc. They can't think cooperatively because they're afraid of what they see as sort of a pending doom moving towards them. And so they start to fight against each other and they tear apart their structures. So this switch between the entropic and the vitalistic is very closely connected to zero sum versus growing the pie. I mean, they are, how do I want to say this? It's one of the single most important parts of human psychology at any given moment is how does it look to you? Which side of that, law of the excluded middle, right? Which side of that split, that diremption, do you perceive yourself as inhabiting? And if you see yourself as inhabiting a zero sum, not enough to go around side, you're, unless you have worked hard to cultivate your character to counteract this natural tendency, you're going to tend to move things in an entropic, destructive direction. Just, it comes naturally to us. It's a survival mechanism. And it's once you're keyed to it, you can spot it everywhere in people's speeches and news articles, in movies, everywhere. There is this, each person is projecting this choice about how they perceive the world, which is then determining which way their limbic switch has been thrown. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Zero sum, it goes right to the heart of that problem.
And the way we infer things from there.
We do.
And it becomes win-lose.
Right.
And from there, it becomes unsustainable.
Right. And part of the reason it becomes unsustainable is that even though at all times we have opportunities to generate more than we can use, to create abundance, whether or not we do it has a lot to do with whether we're in survival mode or not. When we're in survival mode, we'll pass up opportunities to make things better for everybody because we're so worried about what's going to happen to us. And if enough people do that, then in fact, there isn't enough to go around. And there's not enough to go around because we all passed up the chances to create enough to go around. There's a feedback loop at work in this. And what's interesting about it is that when people get into the doom-oriented fatalistic mode, they stop believing that there's a feedback loop. They start believing that contingency is bigger than agency. And so they stop taking advantage of the agency that's available to them to change their circumstances. and they start just trying to adapt to what they imagine to be the overwhelming contingency. So this is what Murray's talking about when he names that final chapter, The Loss of Nerve. He's talking about the way that the Greeks still had the potential to change their world, but they were demoralized enough that their limbic system switch got thrown and they started shifting into an entropic direction. And maybe that played a role in why Philip was able to conquer them, and then Alexander was able to, armed with Aristotle's observations on these very issues, Alexander was able to reorient the Greeks away from staring at each other in a zero-sum staring match that broke out constantly into combat, and instead look out to the larger world and say, there's enough to go around in this huge world. We just have to get out of the tiny little nest we've been squabbling in and go out there, go to Persia, go to India, go to Egypt, go out. He flipped the switch back and got them to be creative again in a Hellenistic way instead of a Hellenic way. And that actually succeeded for a time, a very expensive way, but it succeeded for a time in ending their civil war cycles. What's interesting to me is that possibility was there even before they were conquered by Philip. They just couldn't see it, right? I mean, that it's not that Philip and Alexander gave them a capability they wouldn't have necessarily had. I mean, there's some military innovations that came from the Macedonians, but largely it has to do with their imagination and their how were they perceiving the world. And this goes back to why Kenneth Smith writes this book. Can we question the ways we see the world? The other part of this I want to point out before I call on Stephen is there is a pseudo quote from Einstein. It paraphrases Einstein, where he says, the problems that we've created can't be solved at the same level of consciousness we were at when we created those problems. And another way to say that is any given system of organization generates problems, some of which it can solve using that system, and others of which simply can't be solved by that system. It creates both kinds of problems, the ones within its sphere of influence and the ones outside its sphere of influence. And the only way to solve those consequences that fall outside the sphere of influence of a system is to transcend the system. You have to do something that the system doesn't allow. You have to stretch in a new direction to be able to encompass those bigger problems. So the early stages of an epoch are the stages in which a people is obsessed with overthrowing the old system because it's broken. They're thinking above all about how have I been limited by this system? What are the directions it doesn't let me reach? And how do I break the walls of this labyrinth to move in those other directions and be able to tackle those problems that previously I felt fatalistic about because I couldn't see any way within the system to deal with them. So there's the revolutionary quality of the launch of a new epoch is associated with breaking out of the fatalism of accepting the limitations, the zero-sum game of the old decrepit system. Bye, Sharon, good to see you again. Breaking out of that and moving in a new direction to be able to solve problems the old system couldn't solve. That is the vitality of the revolutionary period of an epoch. That's where its creativity comes from. It comes from largely inside ourselves. It comes from being able to flip the switch away from entropy and zero sum and collapse and despair and feeling trapped in the direction of maybe it's not zero sum. Maybe there can be enough. Maybe I can help create enough. Maybe I don't have to do what I was told to do, and I can try making new mistakes instead of being trapped within the cycle of the old mistakes that we're all sick of. There is this, this Einsteinian quality to the revolution. Not any revolution, but specifically the breach between one epoch and another. There is this quality of ability to tap into the vitalistic forces instead of the entropic forces and create new possibilities. But that's as with the US Revolution being the only revolution we approve of in the United States, that leads in the direction of the flourishing of the new epoch. And the more it flourishes, the greater the pools of wealth that it has created that are privately owned. And the more the possessors of those pools of wealth don't want further disruption. There's been enough disruption, the right amount that allowed them to get these big pools of power. And now that they have it, they don't want to give it up just in order to indulge what they see as the unnecessary creativity of Aristoi or other troublemakers. And so they begin to change the system from within to reinforce a status quo by shutting down the fluxus quo that created the revolutionary in the first place. And the more they succeed in protecting their power that they got as a result of the revolution, the harder it is to have a new revolution. In fact, the harder it is to have any kind of creativity, and the more the system begins to shift away from abundance and back to entropy and zero sum and collapse. The relationship between these is so interesting. And all of this comes out of ethos anthropoi daimon. I mean, it's all, that's why that thing is pretty close to a principle. I mean, all of these are implications of that same thing. So thanks for bringing up. I mean, I hadn't thought about zero sum today until you mentioned it. And now.
No, thank you. Thank you for that.
Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So, as for the socialistic system, after spending all my time up to 50 being a bit Marxist, I couldn't agree less. Sorry to say, but you know, this Marxist vision, if we give all the intellectuals the substance of their life and we give them their Dachau's and all the little things that they'll go forth and produce culture. But reality teaches the opposite. Reality teaches that it's struggle which produces spirit. I'm sorry to say, if I could flick a switch, being just another sheep like the rest of humanity in reality, I know I pretend to be a wolf. I'm a sheep in wolf's clothing. Beware of me.
I love it. That's great.
But when we're given what we want, and this is what a lot of people are expecting today, please create a system for me where everything just comes towards me on a conveyor belt.
There's no creativity in it.
Yeah, I'll just slurp it up, and boy, am I an offender in that regard.
Yes.
But I've looked at myself and I've come to the conclusion that inertia isn't always in the grand scope of the universe the greatest place to be. And I remember Rudolf Steiner making a very interesting point. Now, I don't know who he stole it from. He hung around with a German idealist, and he must have had massive opportunity for idea theft. But he said, the trouble with socialism, you look at it, and the people that all preach socialism, you'll find that there's one hallmark amongst them all. They are the most anti-social people you'll ever meet. That's why they want socialism, but they don't want to create an inner change within themselves. They want to remain inwardly rigid, and they want their socialism like a kid, you know, the parents do all the work for them. They want to remain at that stage of inner rigidity and not learn to transform themselves. Therefore, they're always preaching revolution. Spengler points this out. They always want to change the world. They're just not interested in the hard work of changing themselves. Now, I speak of this as a slightly disinterested party because I could be anything. But I'm wary of people when we adopt this attitude that we're here looking for the progress of humanity or society or of the social group. Yeah, that's nice. But beware of it. It's a bit like, you know, Sodom and Gomorrah. They had a substantial living rise, and look what happened to them. Yeah, this is the old tragic statement, isn't it? You know, to destroy somebody, the gods give them what they want. And so I have to protest and adopt the opposite, even though I don't like the opposite wisdom. Believe me, I'm slack. Spent years desiring socialism until I realised, there's some problems with it. But people so automatically think this is the holy grail when we create a world which every effort has only gone to the social system and not to the spirit. They ignore the spirit. They treat society as a spirit. Look, if you want to have a nicer society, maybe people need to transform that rigid self within and see some value in maybe being nicer to others occasionally, even though they're monsters. If you can give good gifts to your children, even though you're evil, as Jesus said, then that's what counts. And yeah, look, really, this claim of we and I gets on the level of calling ourselves gods. And I've come to think that this is a very suspect statement when humans say that they are gods and that they will decide. I didn't create myself as a human with legs and arms and all these other parts I try to satisfy and an appetite. I've come to think that that is me. But how could it be me when I didn't create it?
Yes.
I am just following the drives of nature. Is that really a me? Am I really a god when I'm just following the drives of nature?
Or am I a symptom?
If the croquet ball comes along and smashes me and I go flying, whee, I'm free. I'm flying through the air. This is all my own choice, man. Yeah, I just have to protest. I've got my doubts. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of things to unpack in that, but I mean, the biggest is this issue of there's more than two choices. It's not capitalism versus socialism by any means. And both capitalism and socialism, in the forms that we've seen them in the 20th century, are both perfectly valid expressions of modernity that don't question it in any way. And they have different recipes for how they have reduced human creativity to the level of entropy, but they both do it. And one of the ways they do it is that neither is what it says it is, right? Because socialism is supposedly everybody's going to take care of everyone else, and there's no corruption. But is that what we saw in the Soviet Union? There's plenty of corruption. I mean, the instant that, the Berlin Wall comes down and glasnost and perestroika are passed, it turns into a kleptocracy run by the Russian mafia. This is, where did they come from? Well, not from nowhere. They were already there. The corruption was already present. And it's the same with capitalism and freedom. Capitalism wants to assert that it equals the marketplace. So if you like a marketplace, then you like capitalism. But the argument could be made, maybe someday we'll spend 3 hours on this, that capitalism is the opposite of the marketplace. The capitalism is to the marketplace as a black hole is to space. It is a gigantic gravity well that distorts the even playing field, right? You can go out there and come up with some innovative thing, and a giant corporation could sue you out of existence because they have more legal power than you do. It doesn't matter whether what you've invented is the best thing anybody ever invented and is necessary for the salvation of humanity. In a capitalist system, it can be erased by somebody who has more power than you do. It's not actually a competition with the way that we talk about it as. So you end up with this choice between, supposedly on the one hand, we're going to either free you physically by supplying your physical needs, or we're going to free you creatively by allowing you to do whatever you want. But what actually happens under the two systems is nobody gets everything that they need, and there's limits to their ability to innovate under socialism as we've seen it. Or under capitalism, we get this scenario where people can't get what they need, and if they get excessively creative, then they get preyed upon until they can't succeed anymore. It's because it's a distortion of the marketplace. So in neither of these I'm agreeing with you about saying in neither of these are we seeing a system that focuses people on the necessary work on their own character. Both of them are very extrinsically oriented, externally oriented, and they pretend between them that they summarize the sum total of all of our choices in a zero-sum game. And in that zero-sum game, they ensure that nobody ever looks for any alternative. What I find interesting about them is how interchangeable they are. I mean, Russia had the most conspicuous socialist revolution early on, and now they're a capitalist society. And they're, how the hell did that happen? I thought they were supposed to be the opposite of capitalism, but evidently not, because it wasn't all that difficult and it happened very fast, the transition from what was supposedly the opposite back to what it is now. So one way of seeing this is that when I talk about the release of creativity associated with a revolution between epochs, a revolution between epochs has to be understood as a completely different kind of thing than any of the revolutions that happened in the 20th century, right? Just because I overthrow my current state government and replace it with another state government, even if I claim all kinds of things, it doesn't mean I've actually entered a new epoch. An epoch is something the whole world moves into, not my isolated country, because I'm still part of these larger relations that have constraints upon what I'm allowed to do or how I'm allowed to express myself. So, I don't know what comes after modernity. I don't know how we get there. I don't know most of the things that need to be known. But looking backwards, I can see the breach between the medieval world and the modern world. And I can see the breach between the ancient world and the medieval world. And I can look at the structure of them and the nature of these things as organisms with life cycles. And from that, I can conclude, not with any kind of certainty, but tentatively, scientifically, I can conclude that almost certainly modernity will at some point also have to come to an end and be replaced by some kind of new epoch that is a negation of modernity in order to escape the forms of corruption that are growing and growing in late modernity. Just like in ancient Rome, the forms of corruption typical of Rome were maximized. Or just like before the Reformation, the forms of corruption characteristic of the medieval world were maximized within the church prior to the 99 Theses being nailed up on the door, right? Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to kind of see a general shape of where we're going, but it's something else entirely to make any claims about any particular society.
I might add on a little bit regards Martin Luther.
Yeah, please.
I find, well, he's a bit of an ogre from an artistic perspective. You have to admire him for his balls of steel, I suppose. But what thinking tends to overlook, for starters, he didn't start out as a Protestant, he was a Catholic, and probably would have viewed himself as a Catholic all his life. He was just simply protesting. But what people overlook, the Protestants proudly look back to Martin Luther as their mentor, which is sort of true. What they forget is their enemies, the Catholics, were also tremendously affected by Martin Luther. They had the Counter-Reformation. They had to clean up their act. And I mean, we ended up with a Catholic Church, which was a bit Protestant itself. So, I mean, Martin Luther created more than the Protestant church. He created the modern Catholic Church to a certain extent as well. But people, they don't think that way. They think beard ball, bang, along comes Martin Luther, bang, he's banged that Catholic ball. Now it's a Protestant ball.
Yeah.
But what we're calling the Catholics has been changed as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That's an outstanding point, and you're right. Nobody talks about that, and they should. I mean, it's astonishing how different the modern Catholic Church is from the medieval Catholic Church. They're really two different institutions in the same way that, me and infant me are two different people. They're just, we're related and we're an organism, but we've come a long way, baby. Yeah, excellent points. Thank you, Stephen. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
It's a kind of a difficult point. I'm going to try to make the connection that you guys are all talking about in a sense, and start with uh, uh, what do you call transaction, and I'm going to move, see if I could get to irony and kitsch. It's a difficult, difficult move. I'm not sure if I could succeed. So imagine we live in a world, a capital world, which everything becomes transactional. It's so embedded within us, it's difficult for us to even understand within us our actual values. And actually, for quite a few people, there isn't such thing. Values lie outside, and you can quantify it in terms of dollars easily. Okay, and so imagine now you're in the woods, whatever you're hunting or whatever you're doing, you're quite away from society, and suddenly you hear somebody screaming in the distance. You go and check it out, and indeed somebody have fell into a deep well, and he needs help. Of course, you would like to help him, but you want to say, it's going to cost you. You know that, right? I'm not going to help you for free, for heaven's sakes. And so that seems reasonable in a funny way. Okay. How much? Of course, you realize this is way out of distance, and it's probably not for days, maybe weeks, nobody's going to come by. So you could really leverage up that conversation quite a bit. So you're bargaining until you finally get to a point where you say, okay, but for me to help you, I have to go, to my little stash and get a rope, right? That's going to cost you as well. So you finally got the guy out. It had nothing to do with your instincts of value. Okay. So you're thinking like, well, you immediately, anybody who's listening to that story will say, there's something weird going on here, right? Even though we understand transactions, there's something that seems to be like he's disobeying something that's deeper than that, which is to help somebody, especially when they're destitute and nobody's going to come around for a month and so forth. All right. So now we go into this situation that we have this conflict between something of a human value and something about something we all value, which is the background story of transactions. And then I'm going to switch to something like, you look at that situation and immediately everybody understands there's irony in that story, right? Like there's something that's juxtaposed that's like, it's funny. It seems like on the one hand, it seems like, yeah, reasonable. On the other hand, it seems totally unreasonable whatsoever. Okay. I remember when I was still in Youngstown, a guy came over and presented an art project. I think I told you guys this story before, but it was very interesting. He built a restaurant right across the street from a Vietnamese hole in the wall, take home restaurant, so to speak. And the restaurant in Vietnamese was named The Horse in Vietnamese. Of course, he built this restaurant, decorated nicely, kind of like neoclassical style. And it's called it in English, The Horse, which is sort of funny. And a lot of very artsy people would show up, like the opening night, show up for this thing because it was a happening in a way. And what they did was the silverware, everything was very, very fancy, and the waiters, everything, all that sort. Okay, so this is an upper class situation, and people would order on the menu, and there were big pane windows, you could see exactly what's happening. So the guy would go across the street and get the stuff and order it and bring it back. So they're not sneaking around the back door. It's like they're coming back and they're dishing this up in fancy plates, and everybody had a riot, right? Like it's like, okay, that's really ironic because people appreciate that. You know, that's really ironic because they didn't pay for the food because they could have gone across the street and got the damn food for a lot cheaper. But there's irony, and they're paying for it. And so the irony, therefore, is in a sense a statement about kitsch. They recognize there's something wrong with the system that art is pointing out, right? It's like, and what kitsch is something that right away you see the juxtaposition within the ironic situation. But if you back that up like 100 years, 200 years, the irony is no longer there because it's shielded by history, because it's created a distance, right? You're not up front and say, oh, there's a juxtaposition, like there's something funny. But now all that funniness is removed. So the history has shielded it and protected it. Oh, this is existing in that period of time. It has nothing to do with your period. And so therefore, you begin to maybe partially excuse and appreciate it for what it was rather than what it is. So at a time when you see art that's talking ironically,
yeah,
it's pointing out the kitsch that will sustain itself in 200-300 years. And say, you know, that is because when I look at, for instance, French furniture from the Rococo period, that to me still seemed like kitsch to me,
yes.
right? But I also appreciate it to a certain degree, right? Because I'm far removed from that, rather than say, God, this is a bad taste, whatever, you know. But now, so there's a funny situation that, you know, distance separates us, but we also have to be able to bring it back, in a sense, to bring up history back and say, no, there was an ironic transition at that time as well. That, you know, that it might be like, yeah, okay, we're moving away from that. So it is that moment, decisive moment, that you see the juxtaposition that it is irony and it later becomes kitsch. And so I think a lot of modern art is pointing that out in a funny way, right? That there's still a lot of people who appreciate the kitsch for what it is, what it was,
Right.
but it's no longer really aesthetically pleasing at that point. But they're not living in a period where the juxtaposition is prominent.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've tried my best to explain the whole idea of kitsch.
That's good.
Maybe that's why we don't understand Martin Luther in a funny
right. Thank you, Phil. And with that, I think we wrap up for this week. And next week, we're in a position to finish off section F now that we sort of see how we got here, and as well as having, you know, cracked open mythos and kind of what that's about. And that means we're going to be able to move on to section G here shortly, character and class. So have a great week. I hope you guys had fun. I had so much fun.
Hey, gee whiz. That's what I'm expecting.
And I love seeing you guys. I love talking with you.